All right. Hi, everyone. So today we are going to talk about Chesapeake Bay. This is going to be our introduction to the unit on Chesapeake Bay. So we'll be talking about Chesapeake Bay for the next few classes. And the reason we're talking about Chesapeake Bay, a place you've never heard of, but the reason we're going to talk about it is because it is a fantastic example of lots of scientific principles related to ecosystems, watersheds, estuaries, and dead zones, things that we've studied very recently. So this will be a good opportunity to put all of these things together. So before we get started, our warm-up for today, which is on Google Classroom, it's called Lesson 11 Warm-Up. It goes something like this. So biodiversity means the variety of species that live in an ecosystem. Why might it be good to have a wide variety of species in one ecosystem? So biodiversity kind of means it means basically the number of species that live in an ecosystem. And so why would it be good to have a very big number of species in one ecosystem? All right, so go ahead and pause the video and do the warm-up. All right, so for today's agenda, we just did the warm-up, which was about biodiversity. Next, we're going to introduce biodiversity. Then I'll quickly introduce Chesapeake Bay. We'll investigate some historical food web data, and actually there is no exit sip today. So the focus questions and learning targets for this unit, for this entire unit, our focus questions are two. First, how have humans affected ecosystems? And second, why is biodiversity important for an ecosystem? The learning target for the next few classes is I can explain how humans have impacted ecosystems. So by the end of our unit, you will be able to answer these two questions and you will be able to do this learning target. All right. So well, we're going to start by talking about biodiversity. And biodiversity is a really important concept for understanding how Chesapeake Bay has changed over time. So before we can really talk about Chesapeake Bay, we're going to talk about biodiversity. And we're going to watch this video called Why is Biodiversity So Important? As we watch this video, I want you to think about this question. Why is biodiversity so important? All right, so why is biodiversity so important? Go ahead and pause the video and think about that for a few seconds. All right, so biodiversity is really important because a biodiverse ecosystem is a resilient ecosystem. We learned a tiny bit about resilience maybe 6 weeks ago, but a resilient ecosystem is an ecosystem that is very difficult to change. It's very strong. If something bad happens to it, it won't really change that much. It'll stay the same. It's really good at adapting. So a biodiverse ecosystem is resilient. It's strong because it has so many species that if one species dies out, then there are other species that can occupy its niche. There are other species that can take on that species role. It's kind of like, it's like a net. If each cross in the net is one species in a really, really biodiverse ecosystem, if one species goes out, then there's just a tiny hole in the net, and nothing can really slip out. But if your ecosystem only has 5 species, and one of those species goes out, suddenly you have a giant hole in your net, and that net is going to collapse. Your ecosystem will collapse. So having a biodiverse ecosystem protects the ecosystem from collapse. All right, so biodiversity is an idea that's going to be important for Chesapeake Bay later. So without further ado, let's talk about Chesapeake Bay. So this is Chesapeake Bay. This is sort of one spot from which you can see Chesapeake Bay, but Chesapeake Bay is this really big bay between Virginia and Maryland. And Chesapeake Bay gets its water from 2 places. First is the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which covers 6 different states. Huge watershed, which means that any rain that falls here has a pretty good chance of making it to the bay, to Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay also gets its salt water from the Atlantic Ocean. So, because Chesapeake Bay has fresh water mixing with salt water from the ocean, Chesapeake Bay is an estuary, and it's actually the largest estuary in the United States. Let me see if I can move my face. There we go. It is the largest estuary in the United States. And because it's so large, it's an excellent place for Americans to do a lot of our fishing. So in Chesapeake Bay, we fish for things like blue crab, oysters, striped bass, and clams. And actually, this estuary is so productive, meaning that there's so many fish in it, that no other American estuary has a higher yield of fish, meaning this is where we get the most fish. No other place has quite as many fish. But the bay is not healthy. You can see this is a satellite image of one part of Chesapeake Bay. You can see there's lots of this green stuff. What do you think this green stuff might be? If you guessed algae, you're totally correct. So the bay, remember from dead zones that nutrient pollution causes algal blooms and fish kills. So there are a lot of nutrients going into the Chesapeake Bay, and that causes algal blooms. And as you remember, when algae dies, decomposers in the water use up all of the oxygen, forming a dead zone. And nothing can survive in a dead zone. So that's why we see we've got some fish kills. We've got some dead fish in the Chesapeake Bay. But where are these nutrients coming from? The short answer is farms. So extra nitrogen and phosphorus. Phosphorus is another nutrient that can cause algal blooms. Come from sewage. So sometimes cities, for whatever reason, dump some sewage into the river. That's always an accident, but it happens pretty often. Um, for a specific reason, and I can talk about that reason another time. But the other way that this extra nitrogen and phosphorus gets into the Chesapeake Bay is from manure, so animal poop. So I lived in Washington, D.C. for a summer, which is on Chesapeake Bay. I had no idea I was living on Chesapeake Bay, but now I do. And when I was there, I was studying pig farms. And one thing that I looked at a lot was how pig farmers will often store the pig's poop kind of like in like a pond, an open air pond, because that's cheaper. It's very cheap to store it like this. But as you can see, when it rains, maybe you can guess what happens. If it rains a lot, this pond is going to overflow, and all that poop runoff is going to go to the nearest waterway, which could eventually end up in the in Chesapeake Bay. Super gross to have even just a little bit of this poop go into the Chesapeake Bay. Is really gross. So I don't have facts about hog farms, but about pig farms, but there are also chicken farms in the area. And factory farms discharge 650 million pounds of chicken manure every year. We don't know how much of this winds up in Chesapeake Bay, but you can guess that it's quite a bit if chicken farmers are storing their poop in the same way that pig farmers are. So pretty gross stuff happening here. So that's one cause of, that is the cause of the dead zones or the dead zone in Chesapeake Bay. But actually there's another problem also facing Chesapeake Bay. And we're gonna get into that problem. We're gonna look at that problem pretty closely. So the question that we're going to ask ourselves this unit is, how have humans affected ecosystems? So we're going to use Chesapeake Bay to answer that question. But to know how humans have affected ecosystems, we kind of have to know to know how humans have changed Chesapeake Bay, how we've affected Chesapeake Bay, we kind of have to know what it was like originally. And unfortunately, even though humans have been in North America for thousands of years, we don't really know what Chesapeake Bay was like. We don't really have data for Chesapeake Bay until 1700, around 1700, which is when European settlers came to North America. So today we're going to look at this historical data, this data from 1700. And then next class we'll look at how the ecosystems have changed since European settlers and then later Americans, since they started changing the ecosystem. So if you go into Google Classroom, there is an assignment called Lesson 11, Chesapeake Bay Historical Food Web Worksheet. And it looks something like this. At the top is the food web from 1700. And there are two things that I want to explain about this worksheet and about this food web. First is question 1 is broken up into 6 parts. Group A, Group B, Group C, D, E, and then F. For each organism, I want you to decide if the organism is abundant or rare. This is actually pretty, this is not very painful. All you do is look at this black circle. All you do is look at the color of the circle. So here on the key it says, if the circle is totally filled in, meaning it's all the same color, that species is abundant. If the circle has like a dark color on the outside, but the inside is a lighter color, that means it's rare. So seals, all one color, all one purple, that means that seals are abundant. Abundant means there are lots of them. Jellyfish, on the other hand, we've got a darker ring and then we've got a lighter circle in the middle. That means it's rare. And so you're going to go through each organism to see if it's abundant or rare. The second thing I wanted to tell you is that this circle right here, it says detritus. / decaying matter / nutrients. Detritus, decaying matter, that just means the bodies of dead organisms. So usually this is not part of a food web. The only things in a food web are the things that eat. Dead organisms are dead, they don't eat. So it's unusual to have this on this food web. But it's on the food web because it's really important to help us understand how the ecosystem has changed. So it's going to be really important, especially next class. So that's kind of why it's here, even though it's very unusual. All right, so for question 1, we already know, decide whether each species is abundant or rare. Question 2 says, the groups from question 1 are organized by trophic level. What trophic level best describes each group? And then one group does not have a trophic level. So what I mean by this is these species are all organized in a certain way. So group A is whales, sharks, seals, and alligators. Whales, seals, sharks, and alligators. These are grouped together because actually these are all tertiary consumers. You can see kind of up here it tells you tertiary consumers. These are the top predators. So you would choose tertiary consumers. Then you would look at group B. What is group B? And then group C, group D, group E, and group F. One of these groups is not any of these trophic levels. So actually, I'm just going to tell you what it is. Detritus is group F. That's decaying matter. Remember, decaying matter, dead bodies, they don't eat. So actually, they are none of these. So you should not have any of these circles filled in for group F. Number 3, the worms / amphipods are found in group C and E. What does this tell you about them? Number 4, look at group F, which is detritus and decaying matter. What do you think the following statement means? Detritus, decaying matter, are not part of the food web, but are very important to the process of matter flow. Number 5 says the producers can be organized based on where they are in the water. Some float and some grow from the seabed. Which producers float and which producers grow from the seabed? Number 6 says, in this ecosystem, which type of producers is more abundant? The producers that float or the producers that grow from the seabed? The two answers are producers that float or producers that grow from the seabed. Number 7, what do the microbes eat? Are they producers, consumers, or decomposers? Number 8, whales and sea turtles eat jellyfish. If the whales and sea turtles become rare in this ecosystem, what do you think will happen to the number of jellyfish? So if whales and sea turtles go down, or if the number of whales and sea turtles goes down, what do you think is going to happen to the jellyfish? Number 9, if whales, sharks, seals, and alligators were removed from the ecosystem, what would you expect the effect to be on the numbers of predatory fish? And number 10, lastly, if the oyster population were reduced, what would you expect the effect to be on the quantity, the number, of microbes, floating algae, and detritus? All right, so fill out this Google form, try your best. None of these answers should come from Google. Google doesn't have these answers, so don't even try. Don't try. Just look at this food web up here and try your best. If you don't know, that's okay. Make a guess. Totally fine. All right. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, good luck.